So what is S3? Now, S3 is short for Simple Storage Service. There's three S's, that's why it's called S3. And S3 is a object storage service from Amazon that provides industry-leading scalability, data availability, security, and performance. So what exactly does that mean? Well, to simplify things, it's nothing more than a place for you to store your files. I want you to think of it kind of like a Dropbox or a Google Drive, but it's run by Amazon. And so because it's part of the AWS ecosystem, it's going to integrate nicely with all of the other services that AWS provides. So it's going to integrate nicely with, things like EC2, Lambda, and most importantly, you have access to IAM. So you can already have a very extensive tool to lock down who has access to all of your files, who's able to open them, who's able to modify and delete them. It's all going to integrate nicely with IAM policies and roles. And in addition, just like any other service, S3, you can access S3 using the console, the CLI, the SDK, as well as the REST API. So S3 is a specific type of storage. It's actually a object-based storage. This is going to be a little bit different than, your NFS and your block-based storage. So the thing about object-based storage is this is used when a system needs access to an entire object or file. And this is going to be a little bit different than something like NFS, which is file-based storage. Right? You can't use this as your NFS source just because, remember, there's no file system, there's no directories within S3. It's just a flat system that stores objects. So it can't be used for NFS. If you're going to use NFS, you want to use Amazon's offering, which is called EFS. And in addition to that, you cannot mount your S3 bucket to a server. So you can't use it like traditional block-based storage. If you want something for block-based storage, you're going to use something like EBS. And so just to reiterate, this is exclusively a object-based storage. It cannot be used in a NFS-based environment. If you need that, then you can use Amazon's Elastic File System, and you cannot use it for anything that you would traditionally use block-based storage. You have to use Elastic Block Storage for that. This is exclusively just object-based storage. So what are some of the common use cases for something like a object-based storage like S3? Well, it's great for storing, log files for your applications. You can store media, so any, images, videos, audio that your application or your web app might be using. You could store that in there. You can use it to store artifacts that get generated from your CI/CD pipeline. And there's actually a ton more opportunities to use S3. I can't really go over all of them, but you'll see that there's a lot of use cases for using it in your overall solution as you deploy your applications. Now, before we proceed any further into diving into the internals of S3, I want to give you one real-world example of how we can utilize S3 when deploying a website or web application. So when you have a website, there's going to be a couple of things that are involved. So the first thing is you're going to have some web server sitting somewhere in some data center. And you're going to have all of the files associated with your website on that web server. And there's a couple of different files, but you're mainly going to have an HTML file, right? So when you go to some website in your web browser, it's just going to a web server and requesting an HTML file and then rendering it out onto your screen. So you're going to have an HTML file. You're going to have a couple of other files like the CSS and the JavaScript files. But on top of that, you're also going to store all of the media associated with that website. So these are going to be things like the images on the website, any music or audio, as well as videos that your website might need to use. Now, when you send a request to the website, what's going to happen is that web server is going to send back the HTML for that website, right? That's going to contain all of the structure of the website. And the HTML file is going to have a link to all of the images and videos that it needs to render out. And that's all going to be hosted on the web server. So what's going to happen is you as the user will then send a request for those images and those videos to the web server. The web server is going to respond back with the images and the video. So that's how a traditional website works. And the problem with this setup is, imagine if this is a website like YouTube or Netflix, where they have just gigabytes and gigabytes, maybe even petabytes of videos being stored on their server, right? It's very expensive to store your videos on your web server. And keep in mind, you don't just have one web server, right? You actually scale up to thousands of web servers scattered across the globe. And if you have thousands of servers, each one of those servers would need to store every single video that was in the Netflix or YouTube database. And that isn't exactly very scalable. And that's the problem with this traditional deployment, where storing all the files on a web server is just not the most scalable solution. And it's also very, very expensive to have storage on a web server. Now, S3 can help us alleviate some of these issues. And so what we can do is we can incorporate S3 into the overall deployment. And so now what's going to happen is you're going to have a web server. And once again, you're going to store your HTML files on the web server. However, you're going to offload all of the videos and media onto S3. So instead of storing those files on a server where it's expensive, you're going to store it on a service that is designed exclusively for storage and has been optimized for storage. So now you as the user, when you send a request to the web server, you'll get back the HTML file. And the HTML file will have a URL which will point back to S3, so it will have the location for all of the media you can download. Instead of having to go to your web server, you now send a request to your S3 service, and it's going to respond back with all of the videos that you want. So now with this solution, your web server is only responsible for a couple of small web files. It's going to be a couple of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript files. And S3 is going to handle the burden of containing and storing and replicating and backing up all of the media, that terabyte and terabytes of data, so that your web servers don't have to do that themselves. So that's really one of the benefits of having a storage solution like S3. So now let's talk about some terminology associated with the S3. And I want to talk about buckets. So files in S3 are grouped together in a bucket. You can think of it as nothing more than just a folder. It's a directory to store a whole bunch of files that are kind of associated together. And the great part is you can have more than one bucket in your account, and you can kind of break it out however you'd like. So if you wanted to have a separate bucket for each one of your applications, you could do that. Or if you wanted to make it so that you have multiple buckets for your application, maybe one for logs, one for media, you could do that as well. Now within buckets, you have something called objects. So objects are just files that are uploaded to S3. Every file is an object. So if you upload 3 PDF files, you've now got 3 objects within your S3 bucket. And an object has a couple of properties associated with them. The first one is going to be a key. So think of that as the name of the file. And then it's going to have a value, which is the actual file data. So if I upload a MP3 song called mysong.mp3, mysong.mp3 is the name of the file, so that's the key. And then the actual file, the actual MP3 file, is the value. Now, there are a couple of other properties associated with an object, like the version ID, the metadata, and a few other things. You don't have to worry too much about them. The main things you want to focus on are key, value, and then if you enable versioning on your S3 bucket, you also have a version ID associated with it. Now, S3 buckets have a flat file structure. So think of it as you only have one single directory and all of your files are in that folder. You can't have nested directories like that. That's not an option. It's just one folder. All the files get uploaded in there. And so when you upload files, you're just going to see a whole bunch of files in a single flat structure. However, if you take a look at the AWS console and you take a look at your S3 bucket, you're going to see something that looks like a folder. And it's going to confuse you because I just told you guys, it's a flat file structure. You can't have directories in there. You can't have nested file structure. So you're going to see something like a music folder like this. And this is a little bit of an illusion. See, when you create objects in S3 with a certain naming structure like this, where you have song 1, song 2, song 3, but you prepend all of those files with a certain name like music, what S3 is going to do is it's going to present all of those files that have the same prefix in a folder-like structure. So since they all have the /music, right, it's going to put them in a folder called music. So in the UI, it's going to look like it's a folder, but in reality, it's just another file with the name of /music/song1, /music/song2, and /music/song3. So don't let that confuse you. Keep in mind, it's always a flat file structure. It's just the name of the key determines how S3 is going to present it to you within a folder-like structure. Now, when you upload a file to S3, what's going to happen is there's going to be some things that happen under the hood that's not presented to you. And this is where AWS kind of handles all the magic for you. But in reality, anytime you upload a file, at the end of the day, that file has to be stored on some server. So on some availability zone, on some virtual machine or server, that file is going to get stored on there so that you can retrieve it later. Now, the problem with this is that if you lose that server, your file's gone. And the great part about S3 is all about durability and high availability. So it's been designed to handle, servers going down, so you don't ever lose your files. So what's going to happen is it's actually going to replicate your file onto multiple servers. So if one of your servers go down, that's okay, your file's on another server. But right now, all of our servers are on one availability zone. So if we lose the availability zone, you'll lose your files. And S3, the great part about S3 is that it can actually handle the loss of multiple availability zones. So what's going to happen is it's going to replicate your files across servers across multiple availability zones. So even if availability zone 1 goes down, you still have availability zone 2 and zone 3. And so that's really one of the benefits of having a service like S3, where it's going to handle the replication across multiple availability zones and multiple servers so that your files are safe and they can handle a loss of a server or an availability zone. Now, when you create a bucket, you're going to have to give it a bucket a name, and that name has to be unique globally across all AWS accounts. So what that means is that if a user in account 1 creates a bucket called KodeKloud, the name of the bucket actually gets embedded in a unique URL that's associated with your bucket. So anytime you want to associate files within this bucket, it's going to use this URL, and the name is embedded inside of it. And that's important because if another user in another account tries to create a bucket called KodeKloud, well, this creates a little bit of a problem because we can't have two URLs going to two different buckets or two different servers. So because of that, we can't do that. And the name of your bucket has to be unique across every single AWS account. So if I create a bucket called KodeKloud, you guys cannot create a bucket called KodeKloud as well. All right, so let's wrap this video up by taking a look at a couple of other detailed points regarding S3, more specifically focusing on restrictions. So S3 can handle unlimited number of objects. So you can keep uploading as much data as you want. There's no limit as to how much data you can store in S3. AWS will handle scaling it up to handle whatever load you send it. Now, the maximum size of a single file is 5 terabytes. So there's no individual file that can be uploaded that can be greater than 5 terabytes. You can upload as much data as you want, but an individual file maxes out at 5 terabytes. And on top of that, AWS accounts by default support up to 100 buckets, and you can increase this up to 1,000 by submitting a service limit increase. And so that's going to wrap this video up. And in the next video, we are going to do a quick demo where we will create our first bucket. So let's go ahead and create our first S3 bucket. So in the search window, search for the S3 service. And that's going to take us to a page like this. And if you don't have any S3 buckets, you'll see something like this, and you can create your bucket right up here. Or if you've already created a bucket before, then you'll see something that looks like this, where it's going to contain a list of all of your buckets, and then you can create a bucket by selecting this button. But more importantly, before we proceed any further, I want you to take a look up here. Notice how it says global here, and it's unchecked all of the different regions. So with S3, it follows a global namespace. So you don't actually select what region you want to work in because it's going to list out all of your buckets across all your regions. And instead, when you create your first bucket, you specify during the creation process what region you want that bucket to be associated with. So let's create our first bucket. I'm going to select create bucket, and we have to give it a bucket a name. And you have to remember this name has to be globally unique. So if I pick something like demo, there's going to be some other user somewhere in the world that's created a bucket named demo. So if I skip all those steps and just select create bucket, it's going to throw an error saying bucket with the same name already exists. Somebody already took this name, so we have to give this a unique name. I'm going to just say this is KK demo -123. All right. And if you want to see the rules for how you can name your bucket, select this link right here. This is going to open up the documentation page to show you what names are allowed and what names are not allowed. After that, we'll select a region. So I'm going to select the US East 1. And if you have any prior existing buckets and you want to just copy all the configuration settings, you can do that right here. Now we've got some settings that I don't want to spend too much time on because this is just an intro video, but we've got the object ownership. So this just determines how you determine, who owns what objects when they get uploaded. Don't worry too much about this. We've got another video coming on about all of this stuff. The same thing down here. This is block public access settings to this bucket. So by default, buckets are locked down. So only you as the creator of the bucket can access it. Nobody else can. Nobody on the internet, no public users, no anonymous users. They can't access it. If you want to open it up, you can obviously select this, and that's going to open it up to the public or allow you to configure it so that public users have access to your files. We're going to just leave that disabled for now. Here we've got versioning. We've got an entire video on versioning as well. Same thing with encryption. And if we go down to advanced setting, there's things like object lock, but go ahead and just select create bucket. And you can see we've now got our bucket. It's called KK-demo-123. We can see what region it's in, and we can see when the bucket was created. So let's select the bucket here, and this is going to take us to the bucket specific page. Here, this window right here is going to contain all the files that have been uploaded to the bucket. It's empty right now because it's a brand new bucket. So let's go to the properties page. And this is going to contain some very basic information on how the bucket has been configured. You can see the region, you can see the ARN, and I'll zoom in for you guys. So this is the unique identifier for this specific bucket. We can see when the bucket was created. You got the status on versioning. Right now, bucket versioning is disabled. There's no tags. Encryption, we're using the default encryption type right here. And then we've got some other information like, server access logging, CloudTrail data events, event notification, transfer, acceleration, object lock, requester pays, and static website hosting functionality. That's all listed here. And these will get updated accordingly as you make changes to your bucket. In the permissions tab, this tab is going to manage who has access to your bucket, who has access to all the objects within your bucket. Remember, by default, your bucket is locked down, so only you have access to it. And so you can define different rules and policies here in the bucket policy section to allow certain users access to certain files and other users to other files. And that's all done in the permissions section. Metrics, this is where you can take a look at all of the CloudWatch metrics with regards to your bucket. So you can see, how much data are you using in your bucket, how many objects have been uploaded to it. So all of that information is going to be stored under the metrics page. Management, this is going to allow you to define, different lifecycle policies, replication rules. If you want to copy objects from one bucket to another, you can do that here. Inventory configurations, and then also access points. This is a little bit more of an advanced feature, which we will cover near the end of the course, but that's where all of these configurations reside. So let's go ahead and upload our first files. And I'm going to go back to the objects page, and I'm going to select upload. And here you can select add files, add folder. Or if you want, you can always just drag and drop, which is what I'm going to do. So I've got this photo right here, and I'm going to upload this. And once you drag it there, it shows you what is the size of the file. So it's about 2.7 megabytes. It tells you it's been able to identify that this is a image. It's a JPEG image. And you can see here we're uploading it to this specific bucket. And here you could change some of the details, or if you want to enable versioning, which once again, we'll cover that in a future video. Permissions, that's just going to follow the default bucket permissions. But then we also got properties. So here we have the different storage classes for S3. So S3 provides different storage classes that provide a varying level of, data access, resiliency, and cost. Right now, we'll just leave everything as default. Like I said, this video is just about very basic understanding of how to work with S3. So we'll just skip all of these settings and we'll select upload. All right, and it's going to upload. We'll see the nice green check mark over there. So that means the file has been uploaded. I will hit close. And then down here within the object section, we can now see that in our bucket, we have one file. So let's click on this file and let's see what information we have access to. So here we can see what region the file's in because that's where the bucket is. We can see the size, when it was last modified. Here we can see the unique URI for this object. And so the URI is always going to be the URI of the bucket and then the name of the key for the file. So that's just the name of the file right here. We could see the ARN for the file as well as the entity tag and then the object URL where we can access it. And then if we scroll down, we could see some other, settings. So things like object lock, storage class, server-side encryption, checksum tags, object lock. So all of these properties are a lot of times on a per object basis. So it's not even per bucket. Each object can have different configuration. But let's go ahead and view our file. So here, this is the object URL. This is where we can access it. Let's click on this and let's see what happens. So if we click on this and I zoom in a little bit, we can see that it says access denied. So why is it saying it's access denied? This is our file. Well, when I click that button, what this is actually doing is this is opening this up from the perspective of a public user. And what I mean by public is a unauthenticated public anonymous user. So just like anybody anywhere in the world can just click this URL and try to go access the file and they'll get denied because remember, everything's locked down by default. So if you want to open the file as your user that you're authenticated with, then select this open button. And you'll see that the URL looks a little bit different. It includes all of your authentication information embedded in there. And so now we can actually view the file. So that's something to keep in mind. So by default, all of your bucket and your files are going to be locked down so that only you have access to them. Nobody else does. But if you change the configuration or the settings, you could tweak it so that you can open it up to the public. And that may be necessary if you're building like a web app and you want to store all of the media for your website within your S3 bucket. All right, so let's go back and I'm going to go back to my bucket. And this time I'm going to create a folder. Remember, S3 doesn't actually have a concept of folders. It just mimics the functionality of a folder, but let's select create folder. And I'm going to call this folder food. And I'm going to open up this folder. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy a couple of files into that folder. So I've got these pictures of food, and I'm going to upload that. I will go through the same process, just select upload. It'll take a little bit just because they're high resolution photos, and then eventually that's going to complete. And so now, if I go back to my bucket, right, you can see I've got the original photo, and then I have my food folder. And you can see it's got a different icon. It's even labeled as a folder, even though I told you it's just a flat file system. And if I go in there, I can see all of the images. So the important thing I want to highlight is that, remember, it's not actually a real folder. What's really happening is if I select one of these files, like burger.jpg, look at the URI or the ARN. It's just the name of the bucket. It's got the original file name, and then it's just prepended by that folder name. So all of these files are all in one directory. It's just every file that's in this food directory is going to be prepended with the /food. So S3 knows to present it like a folder to you as the user, but at the end of the day, on the system, it's just all within one directory. And let's try to open this file up. Remember, if we try to select this, it's going to be locked down because this is us trying to access the file as a unauthenticated user. But if I select open, then it's going to open it as a authenticated user, and we can take a look at the file. Deleting a file is as easy as uploading a file. So if I go back to my bucket, if I want to delete this file right here, I'm going to select that file, and we can just select delete. And then here you have to type in permanently delete just to let it know that we are 100% sure that we want to delete this file. Since we don't have versioning enabled, when we delete this, it's gone forever. So let's select delete. We can see it's successful, and we can see that original file is now gone. And within the S3 UI, we can also create folders and move them around. So if I create a folder, and I'll call this just test or something like that, and I want to move my steak image into the test folder, I could just select the steak image, and I will then select actions, and we will want to then move. And then now what you have to do is you have to provide the full path that you want to move it to. And really what you're doing is when you're moving it to a different folder, you're just giving it a different name. Remember, there's no folders, you're just giving a name. So we'll say S3:// then we have to give it the bucket name. 1, 2, 3. And then now we're just changing the prefix. So we want to move it into a folder test, which is in the food folder. So the full path, the new key is going to be /food/test. And if you don't want to type that out yourself, you can obviously just do the browse, and then it'll take you to the whichever bucket you want, and then you can find the specific folder, and it's going to pre-populate that for you. Right, so all it's doing is just changing the prefix of the key name to be food/test. So we'll select move. It's going to move it. And so now if we go onto the test folder, we could see our steak image. So that's everything I wanted to cover with S3. It's just a very small, quick intro to S3. Let's go ahead and delete our bucket. And so if I go back to buckets and I select this and I'll do delete, you're going to see that it's going to throw an error. It's going to say the bucket cannot be deleted because it's not empty. So you can only delete an empty bucket. So you could select this button right here, which will allow you to delete the bucket. And so now you have to type in permanently delete. So right now we're not actually deleting the bucket. We're deleting the contents of the bucket because we can't delete a non-empty bucket. So I'll select empty. It's now emptied the bucket, and I can hit exit. So this bucket is now an empty bucket, and we can prove that just by going in here, and we can see there's nothing there. And so now, since it's empty, we can then do a delete. And you have to type in the name of the bucket to tell AWS that you're sure that you want to delete it. And now you have successfully deleted your bucket.